He didn't fear bullets until a trembling waitress leaned in and whispered, "Sir, you need to leave. Now." The Mafia boss froze, then saw shadows shifting, guns rising, death seconds away. One warning, one heartbeat, one woman who changed the course of his empire in a single breath. But why did she save him? And what secret was she risking her life to protect? If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. In the dim amber glow of La Fenice, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant, 8-year-old Vincenzo Morano ran his tattooed fingers along the edge of his wine glass, the engraved silver ring on his thumb catching the candlelight. The marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers that had witnessed decades of whispered deals and silent power plays. Tonight was supposed to be routine, a quiet dinner in neutral territory, the kind of evening where empires could rest without bloodshed. He'd survived 2 decades in a world built on loyalty and violence, earning his seat at this table through ruthlessness and calculation. What he couldn't have anticipated was the woman in a server's vest, who would approach with a tray trembling in her hands and whisper the words that would rewrite his fate. Her name tag read Grace, and her eyes held a terror that cut through the restaurant's elegant calm. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Grace Ramirez had been working at La Fenice for exactly 2 weeks, and she still felt like she was walking on glass. At 32, she was running from a past that wouldn't let go her brother's debts, his mistakes, the dangerous men who'd marked her family as collateral. After Miguel's arrest left them drowning in legal fees, she'd taken this job out of desperation, trading her old life for the anonymity of white tablecloths and discreet service. The glittering dining room intimidated her with its hushed power, and Manhattan's elite murmuring over $30 appetizers, but she was determined to disappear into the role. Just another server, just another face. Tonight felt different, though. The maitre d' had assigned her to Section 4, where the dangerous guests dined. "Keep your head down," he'd instructed, straightening his tie with nervous precision. "You don't know who these people are, and you don't want to." Grace nodded, checking her reflection in the polished wine station mirror. Her hands still shook when she carried the heavier trays, but she was learning to hide it. She'd become good at hiding things. She watched Vincenzo Morano enter the restaurant with the quiet confidence of a man who commanded fear without raising his voice. His dark tailored suit fit like armor, and he moved through the space as if the shadows themselves parted for him. The other servers stiffened when he passed. Conversations dropped to whispers, eyes averted instinctively. Grace had never seen his face before, but she recognized power when it walked past her. Tonight he carried himself like a man who believed he was untouchable. As Grace approached his table with the wine bottle, a 2015 Barolo he'd ordered without looking at the menu, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. 3 men, corner table, dark suits identical in cut and color. They weren't eating. One adjusted his cuff, and in that fraction of a second, Grace saw it, the dull metallic glint of a suppressed pistol holstered against his ribs. Another man touched his ear, an earpiece, synchronized communication. The third kept his eyes locked on Vincenzo's table with the cold precision of a predator waiting for the signal. Grace's hands trembled as she poured the wine, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Vincenzo could hear it. She'd seen this before. Miguel had described it once, late at night when the fear finally broke through his silence. How the Sicari group moved, how they positioned themselves before a hit. She had 2 choices: walk away and let whatever was about to happen unfold, or do something so reckless it could get her killed. Her brother's voice echoed in her memory. "They don't just kill the target, Gracie. They kill everyone who sees it happen." Grace leaned close, her voice barely audible beneath the soft jazz piano drifting through the dining room. "Sir, you have to leave. Right now." Vincenzo's eyes lifted slowly, dark and unreadable. For a moment she thought he'd laugh or dismiss her as unstable. But something in her expression, the genuine terror, the way her hand shook against the wine bottle made him pause. He glanced at the reflection in his wine glass. That's when he saw it. The man in the corner reaching beneath his jacket. If this moment gave you chills, then you already know how fragile fate can be. Hit subscribe before you miss the moment that changes everything. Vincenzo Morano had survived 20 years in a world where hesitation meant death, and tonight that instinct saved him. The moment Grace's trembling voice reached his ears, something shifted in the air, a pressure change, like the seconds before lightning strikes. He didn't question her, didn't demand explanations. He simply trusted the terror in her eyes because fear that raw couldn't be faked. His hand moved to the edge of the table, muscles coiling beneath his tailored suit. Then the world exploded. The first gunshot cracked through the restaurant's elegant silence like glass shattering in a cathedral. Someone screamed. A wine glass hit the marble floor, the sound lost beneath the chaos that erupted in waves. Grace's legs gave out. She dropped, her knees hitting the cold floor as plates and silverware crashed around her. Shards of a shattered wine bottle sparkled in the candlelight, scattered like deadly confetti. Above her, Vincenzo moved with terrifying speed, his chair kicked back. The table flipped forward in one fluid motion, creating a shield between them and the gunfire. "Stay down." His voice cut through the pandemonium, sharp and commanding. Grace pressed herself against the floor, her hands covering her head as the dining room transformed into a war zone. Guests scrambled for exits, tables overturned, chandeliers swaying violently overhead. Another shot, then another. The smell of gunpowder mixed with expensive perfume and spilled wine. From the kitchen, Vincenzo's men burst through the swinging doors too late to prevent the ambush, but fast enough to return fire. The air filled with the deafening percussion of competing weapons, each shot echoing off the marble and glass like thunder trapped indoors. Grace couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She'd warned him, but she hadn't expected this. The violence, the speed, the way death moved through a room full of people who'd been laughing seconds before. A hand grabbed her arm. She flinched, expecting a bullet, but it was Vincenzo pulling her tighter against the overturned table, his body positioned between her and the corner where the shooters had been stationed. In that moment, the Mafia boss who commanded fear became a shield made of flesh and bone. "Don't move," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "They're aiming for me, not you." But Grace knew better. Miguel had told her, witnesses don't survive. The gunfire slowed, then stopped. The ringing in Grace's ears replaced the shots with a high-pitched whine. Smoke hung in the air like fog, and through it, she could see the aftermath: overturned chairs, shattered glass, dark stains spreading across the white tablecloths. Vincenzo's men had neutralized the threat. 2 of the shooters lay motionless near the corner table. The third was gone, escaped through the service entrance in the confusion. Slowly, Vincenzo stood, his hand still extended toward Grace. Blood traced a thin line down his cheek, not his own, she realized. Glass from the chandelier. His dark eyes found hers, and for the first time since he'd entered La Fenice, the composed mask cracked, not with fear, but with something that looked almost like disbelief. "You saw them," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the aftermath. "Before anyone else did." Grace nodded, unable to form words. Her entire body shook, adrenaline, terror, shock all colliding at once. She'd never been this close to violence before, never felt the heat of gunfire, never smelled the acrid burn of discharged weapons. Around them, his men worked with military precision, ushering panicked guests toward exits, speaking in low tones to arriving police officers who seemed unsurprised by the carnage. This wasn't the first time La Fenice had seen blood, Grace realized. Just the first time she'd witnessed it. Vincenzo helped her to her feet, his grip firm but surprisingly gentle. Glass crunched beneath her shoes. Her server's vest was torn, spotted with wine and debris. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace." Her voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable. "Grace Ramirez." He studied her face for a long moment, and Grace felt exposed beneath that gaze like he could see through her uniform, past her desperation, into the mess of debt and danger that had brought her here. "Grace Ramirez," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You just saved my life." The weight of those words settled over her like a sentence. If your heart raced reading that, you're already inside this story. Subscribe, don't be the one who walks away before the next gunshot. The restaurant transformed into a crime scene within minutes, but not the kind Grace had seen on television. Police arrived, yes, but they moved with strange deference around Vincenzo's men, asking questions that sounded more like formalities than investigations. Guests were ushered out through side entrances, their shock muted by practiced discretion. Within the hour, La Fenice would be empty, cleaned, and silent, as if the violence had been nothing more than a bad dream. Grace sat on a stool in the industrial kitchen, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders despite the heat radiating from the ovens. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the barrel of that gun, the cold precision in those men's faces. The kitchen door swung open. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His suit was impeccable, his movements controlled. He studied Grace the way a detective studies evidence. "My name is Marco D'Angelo," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm Mr. Morano's head of security. I need to ask you some questions." Grace nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "How did you know?" Marco's eyes were sharp, unblinking. "How did you spot the shooters before anyone else did?" I saw them." Grace's voice trembled. "They weren't eating. They had earpieces. One of them had a gun. A lot of people in that dining room carry weapons, Miss Ramirez." Marco stepped closer, his tone shifting from professional to suspicious. "What I want to know is why a waitress who's been here 2 weeks recognized a professional hit squad faster than trained security." Grace's stomach dropped. He thought she was involved. I didn't." She struggled to form coherent words. "I just noticed something was wrong." People who just notice things like that usually have experience noticing them. Marco crossed his arms. "So I'll ask again. How did you know?" Before Grace could answer, the kitchen door opened again. Vincenzo entered, and the temperature of the room shifted immediately. Marco straightened, his interrogation suspended by his boss's presence. "Leave us," Vincenzo said quietly. "Sir, I need to." "I said leave." Marco's jaw tightened, but he obeyed, casting one last warning glance at Grace before disappearing through the door. Silence settled between them, broken only by the hum of industrial refrigerators. Vincenzo pulled up a stool and sat across from Grace, close enough that she could see the dried blood still tracing that thin line down his cheek. Up close, without the chaos, she noticed details she'd missed before: the tattoos that crept up from beneath his collar, the silver ring engraved with symbols she didn't recognize, the way his eyes held both danger and something unexpectedly human. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice softer than it had been in the dining room. "Not of me." Grace wanted to believe him, but everything Miguel had taught her screamed warning. "Marco thinks I was part of it," she whispered. "Marco thinks everyone is part of everything." Vincenzo leaned back slightly. "But I don't. You could have walked away, could have let it happen. Instead, you risked your life to warn a stranger." I wasn't trying to be brave." Grace's voice cracked. "I just saw them, and I knew what was going to happen, and I couldn't." "How did you know?" The question hung in the air between them. Grace looked down at her hands, still trembling in her lap. She'd kept Miguel's secret for so long, protecting him even when it cost her everything. But now, sitting across from a man whose world operated in shadows and blood, she realized silence might cost her more. "My brother," she said finally, each word feeling like a betrayal. "Miguel Ramirez. He used to work for the Sicari group, the same people who tried to kill you tonight." Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but Grace saw the calculation behind his eyes. "He told me how they operate, how they position themselves before a hit. He wanted out, but Her voice broke. "They don't let people leave. They framed him for theft, destroyed his life. I've been paying his legal fees ever since, trying to keep him alive in prison." "And tonight?" Vincenzo asked quietly. "Tonight I realized they weren't just trying to kill you." Grace's eyes met his, terror and understanding colliding. "They were using your death to send me a message." Vincenzo returned to his penthouse as dawn crept across Manhattan's skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of amber and steel. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, still wearing the blood-spattered shirt from La Fenice, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. Below, the city awakened, oblivious to the war that had nearly erupted in its most elegant restaurant, unaware that one woman's whispered warning had prevented a massacre that would have made headlines for weeks. But Vincenzo's mind wasn't on what had been prevented. It was on what had been revealed. The ambush wasn't just retaliation. It was strategy. The Sicari group didn't move without purpose. They didn't risk an operation in neutral territory where every family had agreed to maintain peace, unless the reward justified breaking sacred rules. Tonight wasn't about killing him. It was about humiliation, about proving that even in his own territory, Vincenzo Morano could be touched. Someone had told them where he'd be. What time? Which table? Someone inside his organization had sold him out. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop. Marco's name flashed on the screen. "Talk to me," Vincenzo said, pressing the phone to his ear. "I've got eyes on the girl's apartment. No movement since she left for work yesterday." Marco's voice carried tension. "But boss, there's something you need to know. Someone's been watching her building. Black SUV, tinted windows. Been parked across the street for the past 3 hours. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. Sicari? Can't confirm, but the plates are registered to a shell company linked to their operations. Marco paused. She told you the truth. They're using her as bait. Vincenzo set down his glass, his mind racing through possibilities. Grace Ramirez had saved his life, and now the Sicari group was circling her like sharks who'd tasted blood. Pull her brother's file, Vincenzo ordered. I want to know everything, what he moved for them, who he reported to, why they framed him. Already on it. Miguel Ramirez, 29. Small-time courier until 18 months ago when $30,000 worth of product went missing on his watch. He claimed he was set up, but the evidence was too clean. Vincenzo finished. They wanted him gone, so they manufactured the theft. Looks that way. Marco's tone shifted. Boss, we can't protect her. Not if the Sicari have marked her family. Best thing we can do is relocate her somewhere they can't reach. No. Vincenzo's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. She stays where I can see her. Silence stretched across the line. Sir, with all due respect, she's a civilian. Getting involved with her family puts us in the middle of... She saved my life, Marco. Vincenzo turned from the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. That means something. In our world, it means she's leverage now. The moment the Sicari realize you value her, they'll use that against you. Vincenzo knew Marco was right. Sentiment was weakness. Loyalty outside the family was risk. In 20 years, he'd built an empire on cold calculation, never letting emotion compromise strategy, never showing mercy that could be interpreted as softness. But Grace Ramirez hadn't calculated. She'd simply acted. And in doing so, she'd reminded him of something he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. Conscience. Have someone watch her building, Vincenzo said finally. Discreet. I don't want the Sicari knowing we're protecting her. And if they move on her, then we move faster. Vincenzo ended the call and walked to the safe embedded in his office wall. Inside, beneath stacks of cash and forged documents, lay a photograph creased and faded, nearly 2 decades old. A young woman with kind eyes and a smile that had once made him believe he could be something other than what his name demanded. She died because of his world, because mercy and violence couldn't coexist, because love made you vulnerable, because the moment you cared about something, your enemies could destroy you by destroying it. He'd sworn never to let that happen again. But tonight, standing in the silence of his fortress, Vincenzo realized something that terrified him more than any ambush. Grace Ramirez's trembling voice had cracked open a door he'd sealed shut years ago. Across the city, Grace lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, unaware of the black SUV idling across the street, unaware that her whispered warning had started a war neither she nor Vincenzo could stop. 3 days passed before Grace heard from Vincenzo Morano again. 3 days of suspension from La Fenice while management conducted their investigation. 3 days of jumping at every sound in the hallway, checking the locks on her apartment door obsessively, watching shadows move past her windows with paranoia that felt both irrational and completely justified. Miguel called from prison on the 2nd day, his voice tight with fear. Gracie, someone's been asking about you. He spoke in rushed whispers, like the walls had ears. One of the Sicari guys in here. Wanted to know where you work, where you live. I didn't say anything. But, Miguel, what did you do? Grace's hands had gone numb holding the phone. Nothing, I swear. But they know you were there that night. They know you warned him. His voice cracked. You need to disappear. Get out of the city. Go somewhere they can't. The line went dead. Grace had tried calling back 17 times. The prison switchboard told her Miguel had been transferred to solitary for his own protection, which only confirmed her worst fears. Now, on the 4th morning, a black car idled outside her building. Grace watched it from her 3rd-floor window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The driver stepped out tall, professional, wearing a dark suit that screamed private security. He looked up directly at her window as if he knew exactly where she was. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Miss Ramirez, Mr. Morano requests your presence. The car is waiting downstairs. Grace's hands shook as she held the phone. Every instinct screamed danger, but a deeper truth settled in her chest. Refusing Vincenzo Morano wasn't an option. Not anymore. She'd stepped into his world the moment she'd whispered that warning, and now she was caught between 2 forces that could crush her without effort. She went downstairs. The penthouse was nothing like Grace expected. She'd imagined dark wood and leather, the aesthetic of movie mobsters intimidating and cold. Instead, Vincenzo's home was all glass and stone and light. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, the city sprawling beneath them like a kingdom. Modern art hung on white walls. Everything felt minimalist, controlled, deliberately empty of personality. Vincenzo stood by the windows, wearing a charcoal sweater and dark jeans the first time Grace had seen him without the armor of a tailored suit. He looked younger somehow, more human, though the danger never quite left his eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said, turning to face her. Grace stood frozen near the elevator, her backpack clutched in front of her like a shield. "Did I have a choice?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Always. But I'm glad you chose to trust me." "I don't trust you." The words came out sharper than Grace intended. "I just don't have anywhere else to go." Vincenzo nodded, accepting the honesty. "Your brother called you from prison." It wasn't a question. Grace's stomach dropped. "You've been listening to my calls?" "I've been keeping you alive." His tone remained calm, matter of fact. "The Sakari group has been watching your building. Your phone. They're waiting for you to lead them to something or someone they can use against me. I'm not going to." "I know." Vincenzo stepped closer, his expression softening in a way that felt almost dangerous. "That's why I brought you here, to talk about your brother." Grace's breath caught. "What about him?" "Miguel Ramirez, 29 years old, convicted of theft, serving 8 years at Rikers. But we both know he didn't steal anything." Vincenzo gestured to a leather folder on the glass coffee table. "The Sakari framed him because he refused to inform on someone. He chose loyalty over survival, and they destroyed him for it." Grace's eyes burned. "If you know all that, then you know he's a good person. He made mistakes, but he protected you." Vincenzo's voice dropped lower. "The person he refused to inform on? It was you, Grace. They wanted to know if you'd seen anything during one of his runs. He told them you knew nothing, that you were innocent, so they made sure he'd never be able to protect you again." The room tilted. Grace sank onto the edge of the white sofa, her legs giving out beneath the weight of that revelation. Miguel had gone to prison to keep her safe, had lost years of his life so she could remain invisible. "I can clear his record," Vincenzo said quietly. Grace's head snapped up. "What?" "The charges against Miguel. I can make them disappear. The evidence, the conviction, all of it. He could be home within weeks." Hope and suspicion warred in Grace's chest. "Why would you do that?" "Because you saved my life. And because—" Vincenzo paused, something unreadable crossing his face. "Because mercy is a language I've forgotten how to speak. Maybe it's time I remembered." Grace stared at him, searching for the trap, the angle, the price that always came with gifts from dangerous men. "What do you want from me?" Vincenzo met her eyes, and for a moment, Grace saw past the Mafia boss to something almost vulnerable beneath. "Nothing," he said. "You already gave me something I didn't know I'd lost." "What?" "A reason to believe there are still people in this world worth protecting." Grace shook her head, standing abruptly. "I don't want to owe you anything. I don't want to be part of your world, part of whatever this is." "You're not in my debt, Grace." Vincenzo's voice remained steady. "We're even. You saved me. I save your brother. After that, you're free to walk away and never look back." But even as he said it, they both knew the truth. In Vincenzo Morano's world, no one ever really walked away, and Grace Ramirez had just become something far more dangerous than a witness. She'd become someone he cared about protecting. Marco D'Angelo had spent 3 sleepless nights following the money trail, and what he'd found made his blood run cold. He stood in Vincenzo's penthouse office now. Surveillance photos spread across the desk like tarot cards predicting disaster. Each image told a story: meetings in dark corners, envelopes exchanged in parking garages, phone records that painted a picture of betrayal so complete it threatened to collapse everything they'd built. "Rico Faletti," Marco said, tapping the central photograph. "Your lieutenant, your friend for 12 years. He's been feeding information to the Sakari group for at least 8 months." Vincenzo stared at the evidence in silence, his jaw tight. Rico, who'd stood beside him through 3 territorial wars, who'd saved his life in Brooklyn, who'd been trusted with operations worth millions, had sold him out. "How much?" Vincenzo's voice was dangerously quiet. "The ambush at La Fenice? Rico gave them your location, your security detail, the exact time you'd be alone." Marco's finger traced the timeline across the photos. "But it goes deeper. The shipments we lost last year, the raid on our warehouse in Queens, all of it leads back to him." "Why?" Vincenzo's hands curled into fists on the desk. Money? Power. Marco pulled out another document: communications between Rico and the Sicari leadership. They promised him control of your territory after you were eliminated. He was supposed to take over, running the Moreno operations as their puppet. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could. Vincenzo stood, walking to the windows overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, Rico Folletti was moving through the world believing he'd gotten away with it. Believing his boss didn't know that every loyalty, every oath, every moment of brotherhood had been theater. Where is he now? His apartment in Tribeca. Wants to meet tonight to discuss security improvements after the restaurant incident. Marco's tone carried bitter irony. He doesn't know we've found him out. Vincenzo's reflection stared back at him in the glass. A man whose empire had been built on loyalty and fear, now discovering that neither was as solid as he'd believed. His phone buzzed. Grace's number. "I need to take this," he said, answering before Marco could object. "Grace? Someone broke into my apartment." Her voice shook with barely controlled panic. "I came home and everything's destroyed. My clothes, my furniture. They were looking for something. And Miguel." Her voice cracked. "Miguel is gone." Vincenzo's entire body went rigid. "What do you mean gone?" "The prison called. Said he was transferred to another facility, but they won't tell me where. They said it's for his protection. But..." Grace's breath came in gasps. "This is because of you. Because I saved you. They're taking everyone I love and I can't. Where are you right now?" "Standing outside my building. I don't know where else to..." "Stay there. My driver will be there in 5 minutes. Don't go inside. Don't talk to anyone." Vincenzo was already moving toward the elevator. "Grace, listen to me. You're safe. I promise you're safe." But even as he said it, Vincenzo knew the promise was hollow. Marco caught his arm. "Boss, we have the meeting with Rico in 3 hours. If you leave now, reschedule it. We can't afford to wait. If he suspects we know, then handle it." Vincenzo pulled free, his voice sharp with authority. "I'm not letting the Sicari use her as bait while we play politics with a traitor." Marco's expression hardened. "You're making her a priority over the man who tried to kill you. She's the reason I'm alive to deal with him at all." Vincenzo stepped into the elevator, but Marco's voice stopped him before the doors closed. "Sir, you need to understand something. The moment the Sicari realize you care about her, she becomes your greatest vulnerability. They'll use that. They'll hurt her to hurt you." Vincenzo met Marco's eyes, his jaw set. "Then we make sure they never get the chance." Grace stood on the sidewalk, her backpack clutched against her chest. Watching the traffic blur past through tears, she refused to let fall. Her apartment destroyed. Miguel disappeared. Everything she'd tried to protect, everyone she'd tried to keep safe, slipping through her fingers like water. A note had been left on her kitchen counter, written in handwriting that looked deliberately childlike. "Is greater than you saved the wrong man, Grace. Now everyone pays." She'd grab the note and run. Now, standing in the cold October air, Grace realized the terrible truth. Her whispered warning hadn't saved anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable. The black car pulled up to the curb, and Vincenzo stepped out before the driver could open his door. He walked straight to Grace, his expression unreadable, and for the first time since that night at La Fenice, she saw something in his eyes that looked like fear. "They took Miguel," she whispered. "I know." Vincenzo's voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "And we're going to get him back." "How? You don't even know where he is." Vincenzo placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle for a man whose world was built on violence. "Grace, there's something you need to understand about the people who did this." His dark eyes held hers. "They don't just want to hurt you. They want to destroy me by destroying everyone I..." He stopped himself, the words catching. "Everyone I choose to protect." "Then stop protecting me." Grace's voice broke. "Let me disappear. Let me..." "It's too late for that." Vincenzo opened the car door. "The moment you whispered my name, we became connected. And in my world, that connection is permanent." Grace climbed into the car, her hands still shaking. As Manhattan blurred past the tinted windows, she realized she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She'd saved a Mafia boss's life. And now, whether she wanted it or not, Vincenzo Morano had decided her life was worth saving too. If you think trust means safety, you've never lived in Vincenzo's world. Subscribe now because in stories like this, mercy always has a price. The Brooklyn safe house sat in an industrial wasteland where the city pretended not to look. Abandoned warehouses, rusted shipping containers, and streets where streetlights had stopped working years ago. Vincenzo's intelligence had been precise. The Sicari group used this location to hold people they wanted to leverage, people who were worth more alive than dead, people like Miguel Ramirez. Grace sat in the back of the armored SUV, a bulletproof vest heavy against her chest, watching Vincenzo's men prepare for the extraction. Marco distributed weapons with military efficiency, suppressed pistols, tactical gear, communications equipment that looked like it belonged to a SWAT team. "You should have left me at the penthouse," Grace said, her voice tight. Vincenzo adjusted his own vest, checking the magazine of his Glock with practiced ease. "If I'd left you there, you'd have found a way to come anyway. At least this way, I can keep you alive." "This is insane. I'm not trained for—" "You're staying in the car." Vincenzo's tone left no room for argument. "The moment we have Miguel, we extract. You don't move. You don't leave this vehicle, and if anything goes wrong," he met her eyes, "you drive away and you don't look back." Grace wanted to argue, but the fear in her throat wouldn't let the words form. Marco approached, his expression grim. Thermal imaging shows 4 heat signatures inside. 2 on the ground floor, 2 upstairs. Could be Miguel, could be guards. "We won't know until we're inside. Then we go in quiet." Vincenzo checked his watch. 3 minutes. "Everyone knows their positions?" His men nodded in unison, moving like shadows toward the warehouse entrance. Grace watched them disappear into the darkness, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Through the SUV's reinforced windows, the warehouse looked like a tomb, silent, dark, waiting to swallow the men who'd just entered. 2 minutes passed. Then, 3. Grace counted her heartbeats, each one screaming that something was wrong. Then she heard it, a single gunshot, muffled but unmistakable. Then another. Then the world exploded into chaos. Inside the warehouse, Vincenzo moved through the shadows with Marco at his side, their movements synchronized from years of operating in darkness together. The ground floor was empty, just shipping crates and the smell of rust and decay. But upstairs, light leaked through the cracks of a reinforced door. Vincenzo signaled. Marco positioned himself on the left, weapon raised. On Vincenzo's count, they breached. The door splintered inward. Inside, Miguel Ramirez sat tied to a metal chair, his face bruised and swollen, blood crusting his split lip. 2 Sicari guards spun toward the intrusion, reaching for weapons, but Vincenzo and Marco were faster. 2 shots, both guards dropped. "Miguel!" Vincenzo crossed the room, cutting the ropes binding Grace's brother. "Can you walk?" Miguel's eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow. Who are you?" "Someone who owes your sister a debt." Vincenzo hauled Miguel to his feet, supporting his weight. "We need to move, now." But as they turned toward the door, Marco's voice cut through the urgency. "Boss, we've got a problem." Footsteps, multiple, coming up the stairs. They'd walked into a trap. Grace watched the warehouse windows explode with gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to drive away like Vincenzo had ordered. But Miguel was in there, and so was the man who'd risked everything to save him. She grabbed the door handle, then froze. A figure emerged from the shadows behind the SUV, tall, familiar, wearing the same tactical gear as Vincenzo's men. Rico Faletti. He tapped on her window with the barrel of a pistol, his smile cold and victorious. "Grace Ramirez," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "The girl who started all of this. Vincenzo's downstairs fighting my men, thinking he's rescuing your brother. He doesn't realize the real prize isn't inside, it's right here." Grace's hands trembled on the door lock. Rico pressed the gun against the window. "You have 2 choices. Open this door and come with me quietly, or I put a bullet through this glass and drag you out. Either way, you're coming with me. The Sicari group has plans for you." Through the warehouse windows, Grace could still see gunfire flashing. Vincenzo was trapped inside, fighting a battle he didn't know he'd already lost, and she was the reason why. "Tick-tock, Grace." Rico's finger moved to the trigger. "Vincenzo cares about you. That makes you valuable. And in our world, valuable things don't stay free for long." Grace's mind raced through impossible options. If she opened the door, Rico would take her leverage against Vincenzo, bait for another trap. If she didn't, he'd shoot through the glass and take her anyway. But there was a third option. Her hand moved to the SUV's gear shift. Rico saw the movement too late. Don't. Grace slammed the vehicle into reverse, the engine roaring as the SUV lurched backward. Rico dove aside as 2 tons of armored steel crashed through the chain-link fence behind them. Grace spun the wheel, shifted into drive, and did the one thing that terrified her most. She drove straight toward the warehouse. Vincenzo heard the crash before he saw it, the SUV smashing through the warehouse's loading bay door in an explosion of metal and glass. Grace emerged from the driver's seat, her face pale but determined, the bulletproof vest making her look smaller than she was. "I told you to stay in the car," Vincenzo shouted over the gunfire. "And I told you I don't take orders from Mafia bosses." Grace grabbed Miguel's other arm, helping support his weight. "Rico's outside. He was waiting for me. This whole thing was a setup." Vincenzo's jaw clenched. He knew we'd come. Miguel's voice came out weak, barely audible. "Gracie, is that really you?" "I'm here, Miguel, I'm here." Tears streaked Grace's face as they stumbled toward the damaged SUV. "We're getting you out." Bullets ricocheted off the concrete around them. Marco provided covering fire as Vincenzo and Grace hauled Miguel into the vehicle. The moment they were inside, Grace hit the accelerator, the SUV roaring back through the shattered loading door into the night. Behind them, the warehouse erupted into flames, Rico's final message, written in fire and destruction. Grace's hands shook on the steering wheel, adrenaline crashing through her system like a tidal wave. In the back seat, Vincenzo held pressure on a wound in Miguel's side, his expression dark with fury and something that looked almost like admiration. "You drove into a war zone," he said quietly. "You went into one for my brother." Grace's voice trembled. "Guess that makes us even." But as Manhattan's lights appeared on the horizon, they both knew the truth. They weren't even. They were bound by something far more dangerous than debt. They were bound by a choice, the choice to save each other, no matter the cost. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was controlled chaos, doctors moving with practiced urgency, nurses calling out vitals, the sharp antiseptic smell mixing with blood and fear. Miguel lay on a gurney, consciousness fading in and out as trauma surgeons assessed the damage. The bullet had missed vital organs, but he'd lost blood and endured days of interrogation that had left him broken in ways that went beyond physical wounds. Grace sat in a plastic chair outside the operating room, still wearing the bulletproof vest, her hands stained with her brother's blood. She couldn't stop shaking, couldn't process what she'd done driving into gunfire, pulling Miguel from that nightmare, becoming part of a violence she'd spent her entire life trying to avoid. Vincenzo stood nearby, speaking in low tones with Marco. His expression was carved from stone, but Grace could see the fury radiating beneath the surface. Rico Folletti had orchestrated everything: the ambush at La Fenice, Miguel's kidnapping, the trap at the warehouse, every move calculated to destroy Vincenzo from the inside out. The Sicari promised him everything, Marco was saying, his voice tight with disgust. "Your territory, your operations, your reputation. All he had to do was deliver you and her." Vincenzo's eyes flickered to Grace, something protective flashing across his face before the mask returned. "Where is he now?" "Gone. Disappeared after the warehouse. But we'll find him." Marco's hand rested on his weapon. When we do, I deal with him personally." Vincenzo's voice carried the weight of an executioner's promise. A doctor emerged from the operating room, pulling down his surgical mask. "He's stable. The bullet's out. No permanent damage. He'll need rest and physical therapy, but he'll recover." Grace's entire body sagged with relief, tears finally breaking through the shock. "Can I see him?" "He's sedated, but yes. 5 minutes." Grace stood on unsteady legs, moving past the doctor into the recovery room. Miguel looked small beneath the hospital sheets, his face still bruised, an IV dripping clear fluid into his arm. But he was breathing. He was alive. She took his hand, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Miguel. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't warned Vincenzo that night." "Grace." The voice came from behind her. Vincenzo, standing in the doorway. "This isn't your fault. You saved my life. What happened after is on them, not you. They took him because of me, because I chose to. You chose courage over silence." Vincenzo stepped closer, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "In a world where most people look away, you saw danger and you spoke. That's not weakness, Grace. That's strength." She turned to face him, this dangerous man who'd risked everything to save her brother. "Why did you do this? You could have let them take Miguel. You could have walked away." Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't quite name. Because you reminded me of someone I lost. Someone who believed people could be better than their worst choices. His jaw tightened. She saved me once too. And I wasn't strong enough to save her back. Grace saw it then, the crack in the armor, the wound beneath the Mafia boss exterior. What happened to her? My enemies found out I loved her. They used that love as a weapon. Vincenzo's voice went cold with old pain. I buried her 20 years ago, and I swore I'd never let myself care about anyone outside the family again. Then why risk everything for us? Because you didn't ask me to. You didn't demand protection or leverage my guilt. You just acted pure instinctive decency in a world that's forgotten what that looks like. He met her eyes. And maybe I needed to remember that saving someone isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile. Before Grace could respond, Marco burst through the door, his face pale. Boss, we've got a problem. Rico didn't run. He's at your penthouse. And he's not alone. He brought the Sicari leadership with him. They're waiting for you. Vincenzo's entire demeanor shifted, the vulnerability vanishing behind the calculating predator. How many? 8. Maybe more. They want a meeting. Said if you don't show in the next hour, they'll burn everything you've built to the ground. Grace's blood went cold. It's a trap. You can't go. Vincenzo looked at her, and for a moment she saw both the man who'd protected her and the killer who'd survived 20 years in a world built on blood. I have to. If I don't face this now, they'll never stop hunting you. Hunting Miguel. Hunting everyone I've tried to protect. Then I'm coming with you. Grace. You came for my brother. Now I'm coming for you. Her voice was steadier than she felt. You said we're even, but we're not. Not until this is finished. Vincenzo studied her face, the frightened waitress who'd become something far braver than he'd expected. If you come, there's no going back. You'll see things that will change you. Things you can't unsee. Grace thought about Miguel, broken and bleeding because of her choices. About Vincenzo, who'd risked his empire to save a stranger's brother. About the note left in her apartment. You saved the wrong man. Maybe she had. Or maybe she'd saved exactly the right one. Then let's finish this, she said. If that line hit you deep, then you understand loyalty isn't always blood. Subscribe, or tell us in the comments why you'd walk away when others stayed. The penthouse looked exactly as Grace remembered: glass, stone, and silence overlooking Manhattan's glittering expanse. But now it felt like a tomb. Rico Folletti stood at the center of the living room, flanked by 4 Sicari lieutenants in dark suits. They'd made themselves comfortable, pouring Vincenzo's expensive scotch, sitting in his furniture like conquerors claiming territory. The man at the center was older, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, with eyes that held the cold calculation of someone who'd built an empire on other people's suffering. Antonio Sicari himself, the head of the family that had declared war on Vincenzo's empire. Vincenzo. Rico's smile was poison wrapped in silk. So glad you could join us. I was just telling Antonio about your recent vulnerabilities. Grace stood slightly behind Vincenzo, Marco and 3 other men forming a protective wall around them. The air crackled with violence waiting to ignite. You brought them to my home, Vincenzo said, his voice dangerously quiet. Broke the oldest rule we have. Neutral ground means something, Rico. Or it used to. Rules are for people who still believe in honor. Rico gestured to Antonio. The Sicari group understands what you've forgotten. Power isn't about loyalty or tradition. It's about adapting, evolution. Antonio Sicari stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate. Vincenzo Morano, I've heard so much about you. The last of the old guard, clinging to codes that died decades ago. His gaze shifted to Grace. And this must be the waitress, the one who saved your life. Grace felt the weight of his attention like a physical threat. She has nothing to do with this, Vincenzo said. On the contrary. Antonio's smile was reptilian. She has everything to do with this. Rico tells me you risked your organization to save her brother. Drove into a firefight personally. Very sentimental of you. Get to the point. The point is simple. Antonio clasped his hands behind his back. Your empire is crumbling. Your lieutenant betrayed you. Your men are questioning whether you still have the strength to lead. But I'm offering you a way out. Join us. Merge the Morano operations with ours. You become my second in command, and everyone walks away alive. And if I refuse, then we finish what we started at La Feniche. But this time, there's no waitress to warn you. Antonio's eyes gleamed. We take everything: your territory, your assets, your legacy. And we start with everyone you care about. The threat hung in the air like a noose. Vincenzo stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Grace could feel the calculations running behind his eyes, the odds, the consequences, the weight of 2 decades building an empire now teetering on the edge of collapse. "You want my answer?" Vincenzo said finally. "I do." Vincenzo looked at Rico, the man he'd trusted, the brother who'd sold him out for power. Then his eyes moved to Grace, standing terrified but refusing to look away, and something in his expression shifted. 2 weeks ago I would have said yes, Vincenzo began, his voice carrying across the penthouse. I would have calculated the odds, weighed the cost, and chosen survival over principle. Because that's what this world taught me: loyalty is currency, mercy is weakness, and sentiment gets you killed. Antonio's smile widened. "Then we have an agreement." But then a frightened waitress whispered 3 words that saved my life. And in doing so, she reminded me of something I'd buried so deep I thought it was dead. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. Conscience. The belief that some things are worth protecting even when it costs everything. Rico's expression darkened. "Boss, don't be stupid. I'm done being smart." Vincenzo turned to face Antonio directly. "You want my empire? Come take it. But you'll do it the hard way, through blood and fire and every resource I have left. Because I'm not joining you. I'm not bending. And I'm sure as hell not sacrificing the people who showed me more loyalty in 2 weeks than you've shown anyone in your entire life." The room went deathly silent. Antonio's smile vanished. "You're choosing a waitress over your legacy? I'm choosing humanity over empire. If that's weakness, then I'll die weak." Vincenzo's hand moved subtly toward his weapon. "Now get out of my home." For a moment, Grace thought Antonio would give the order that bullets would fly and everyone in the penthouse would die in the next heartbeat. But Antonio simply nodded, turning toward the elevator. "You've made your choice, Vincenzo. Live with it for however long you have left." The Sicari lieutenants followed, leaving only Rico standing alone in the center of the room. "You're making a mistake," Rico said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "She's made you soft, weak, everything we built." "Everything I built," Vincenzo corrected. "You just sold it to the highest bidder." Rico's hand moved toward his weapon. Marco was faster, his pistol drawn and aimed in a fraction of a second. The room exploded with tension, 7 guns pointing at one man. But Vincenzo raised his hand, stopping Marco from firing. "No," he said quietly. Rico blinked, confused. "What? You betrayed me, tried to have me killed, orchestrated the kidnapping of an innocent man." Vincenzo stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In the old world, I would have killed you myself. Slowly. Made sure everyone knew what happens to traitors." "Then do it," Rico spat. "Prove you still have the spine. But that waitress you despise? She taught me something more valuable than revenge." Vincenzo's expression was unreadable. "Mercy isn't weakness. It's the hardest choice a man can make." Grace's breath caught. "You're exiled," Vincenzo continued, "stripped of rank, protection, and territory. You leave New York tonight. If I see you again, if I hear you've tried to rebuild, if you so much as whisper my name, then mercy ends and the old rules return." Rico's face twisted with humiliation and rage. "You'll regret this." "Maybe." Vincenzo turned away, dismissing him like the traitor was already a ghost. "But at least I'll regret it as the man I choose to be, not the monster this world tried to make me." Rico stumbled toward the elevator, broken and powerless. When the doors closed, silence settled over the penthouse. Grace realized she'd been holding her breath. "You let him live," she whispered. "I let him leave," Vincenzo corrected, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Because you were right, Grace. Killing him wouldn't make me free. It would just prove that violence is the only language I speak." Marco holstered his weapon, his expression conflicted. "Boss, the men won't understand. They'll see this as, let them." Vincenzo walked to the windows, staring out at the city he'd fought for decades to control. If they can't follow a leader who chooses mercy, then they're following the wrong man. Grace approached slowly, standing beside him at the glass. "What happens now?" "Now?" Vincenzo's reflection smiled, tired, genuine, almost peaceful. "Now we rebuild. Not an empire built on fear, but something better, something worth protecting. The Sicari won't stop. They'll come for you. Let them come." Vincenzo turned to face her, and Grace saw the man beneath the Mafia boss, scarred, haunted, but still fighting to be something more. I spent 20 years believing power meant never showing weakness. You proved that wrong in 3 seconds. Maybe it's time I learned a different kind of strength. The morning after Rico's exile, Grace sat in Vincenzo's penthouse, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold and crimson. She hadn't slept. Neither had Vincenzo. They'd spent the night in silence, not uncomfortable, but waited with the understanding that everything had changed. The Mafia boss who'd built an empire on fear had chosen mercy. The frightened waitress who'd wanted only to disappear had driven into gunfire to save him. Now they sat across from each other, coffee growing cold between them, both wondering what came next. The hospital called, Grace said finally, breaking the quiet. Miguel's being discharged this afternoon. The doctors said he'll make a full recovery. Good. Vincenzo's voice was hoarse from exhaustion. I've arranged for him to stay at a secure location until the Sicari situation stabilizes. He'll have protection, medical care, whatever he needs. Grace studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes. The tension still coiled in his shoulders despite his attempt to appear calm. You can't protect everyone forever, Vincenzo. I can try. At what cost? Grace leaned forward, her eyes searching his. You spared Rico. You refused Antonio's deal. You chose mercy over everything you've built for 20 years. What happens when your men realize their boss has changed the rules? Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers. Some of them will leave. Some will see it as weakness and try to take what I have left. But the ones who stay— He looked up, meeting her gaze. The ones who stay will be the ones worth keeping. And if no one stays? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Then I'll rebuild from nothing. Wouldn't be the first time. Grace felt something shift in her chest: admiration, fear, recognition. This man had survived 2 decades in a world that killed men for showing compassion. And here he sat, betting everything on a different path because a stranger had whispered a warning. Why? She asked. The question she'd been holding since last night finally breaking free. Why risk everything for mercy? For me? For Miguel? We're nobody to you. Vincenzo set down his coffee cup, his tattooed fingers tracing the rim with deliberate slowness. 20 years ago, I loved someone. Elena. She was everything this world isn't: kind, hopeful, certain that people could be better than their worst choices. His voice went distant. My enemies found out about her. Used that love as leverage. When I refused to bend, they killed her. Made it look like an accident. But I knew. I've always known. Grace's breath caught. I buried her and swore I'd never let myself care about anyone outside the family again. That love was a weakness I couldn't afford. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. But then you saved my life, not because you owed me, not because you wanted something, but because your conscience wouldn't let you stay silent. And I realized Elena was right all along. The moment you stop fighting for what's decent, you lose the only battle that matters. Tears burned Grace's eyes. I'm not her. I can't replace. You're not supposed to. Vincenzo's voice was gentle. You're Grace Ramirez, the woman who drove into a war zone for her brother, who reminded a killer that mercy isn't weakness, it's the hardest thing we can choose. He stood, walking to the windows overlooking the city. You didn't replace anyone. You just woke up the part of me I thought died with her. Grace joined him at the glass, their reflections ghostly in the morning light. What happens now? Now you go back to your life. Take care of Miguel. Build whatever future you want. Vincenzo turned to face her. And you know that if you ever need anything, there's someone in this city who owes you everything. We're even, Grace said, echoing his words from weeks ago. No. Vincenzo's smile was sad and genuine. We'll never be even. You gave me something worth more than my life. You gave me back my humanity. Grace reached out, squeezing his hand once, a connection that spoke louder than words. Then use it. Don't let what we went through be for nothing. I won't. The promise hung between them like an oath. When Grace finally left the penthouse, the morning sun was fully risen, flooding the streets with light. She walked toward the hospital where Miguel waited, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. Behind her, Vincenzo Morano stood at his window, watching her disappear into the city, a woman who'd saved his life by believing courage was worth the cost. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Messages from lieutenants demanding explanations, from rivals sensing weakness, from a world that didn't understand why a mafia boss would choose mercy over empire. Vincenzo silenced them all. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't care about power or territory or the empire he'd built on other people's fear. He cared about the choice he'd made to be the man Elena believed he could be, to honor the courage Grace had shown him, to prove that even in the darkest corners of the city, humanity could still win. The whisper that had saved his life, "Sir, you have to leave now," echoed in his memory. 3 words from a trembling waitress. 3 words that had shattered his perfect evening and rebuilt his broken soul. Vincenzo turned from the window, already planning his next move. Not revenge or expansion or the ruthless calculations that had defined his empire, but something harder. Redemption. The kind that came from choosing mercy when violence would be easier, from protecting the innocent when it cost everything, from believing as Elena once had, as Grace still did, that people could be more than their worst moments. In a city where silence kept people alive, Grace Ramirez had chosen to speak, and in speaking, she'd saved not just a mafia boss but the last piece of humanity inside him. That whisper became the moment when 2 broken lives intersected, proving that even in the darkest corners of power, kindness could still rewrite the ending. Vincenzo Morano picked up his phone and made the first call, not to his lieutenants or his enforcers, but to his lawyer. "I want to set up a foundation," he said, "for people rebuilding their lives after prison. Anonymous funding. I'll send you the details." As he spoke, he thought of Miguel Ramirez, a good man destroyed by one mistake, now given a second chance. He thought of Grace, the frightened waitress who became the bravest person in a room full of killers. And he thought of Elena, whose memory had haunted him for 20 years, but whose hope he was finally ready to honor. The sun climbed higher over Manhattan, burning away the darkness, illuminating a city full of violence and beauty, fear and courage, empires built on blood and lives rebuilt on mercy. And somewhere in that vast landscape, Vincenzo Morano chose to become someone new. Not because he had to, but because Grace Ramirez had whispered 3 words that changed everything, and he'd finally learned to listen. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.